The warm sunlight filtered through the trees, casting playful patterns on the path as Sarah took her usual morning stroll through the city park. It was one of the few moments of peace she got between her grueling night shifts at the hospital. She had just finished a particularly long shift and wanted to shake off the weight of exhaustion. The park was alive with activity, joggers passing by, children playing, and dogs barking in the distance, but Sarah was lost in her own thoughts. Her sneakers crunched softly on the gravel, a soothing sound that helped ease the tension in her shoulders. She had always found solace here, away from the hustle of her work as a nurse. The park was her haven, her escape. As she rounded a bend, something unusual caught her eye. An elderly man, dressed in a finely tailored suit, stumbled on a raised section of the path. His cane clattered to the ground, and he fell hard onto his side, wincing in pain. Without hesitation, Sarah rushed over. Her nurse instincts kicked in immediately. She crouched beside the man, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her voice full of concern. The man grimaced but gave her a weak smile. "It seems my feet are no longer as steady as they once were," he said, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "I'm afraid I might have misjudged the path." Sarah helped him sit up slowly, taking care to check if he had injured himself. "Let me take a look. Are you in any pain? Does anything hurt when you move?" The man winced as he shifted his weight, but his eyes remained sharp. He was clearly uncomfortable but also trying to maintain a certain dignity. Sarah noticed his elegant suit, too elegant for a casual park stroll, and the expensive watch gleaming on his wrist. "No broken bones, I think," he said, attempting to stand with her help. His hand gripped hers tightly, and for a moment, Sarah felt the strength hidden beneath his frail appearance. "I should be fine in a moment. I'm just embarrassed, to be honest." "Don't be," Sarah replied with a smile. "It happens to the best of us." Once he was standing, Sarah noticed the subtle signs of age in his face, deep lines around his eyes and mouth, the slight tremble in his hands. But there was something else about him, something refined, almost regal. His presence seemed to command respect, though his posture had been humbled by the fall. "Thank you, young lady," he said, dusting off his trousers. "You have quite the gift for helping people. I can see that." "I'm a nurse," Sarah explained, her cheeks flushing slightly from the compliment. "Just doing my job." He chuckled softly. A noble profession indeed. As they continued to talk, Sarah couldn't help but wonder about this elderly man who seemed so out of place. Why was he alone, walking through the park in such fine clothes? And why did he seem relieved when she didn't ask too many personal questions? Before she could delve deeper into her thoughts, the man introduced himself. "I'm Charles, by the way. And you are?" "Sarah," she replied, giving him a friendly smile. "Can I walk you to a bench?" "It might be good to sit for a while just to make sure you're okay." Charles hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the park before he nodded. "I think that's a good idea. I could use a bit of rest." As they walked, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm in his presence, though the mystery surrounding him gnawed at the back of her mind. There was something about Charles, something beyond his fall, beyond his clothes, that intrigued her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a chance encounter. When they reached the bench, Charles sat down carefully and looked out at the park with a contemplative expression. "You come here often, don't you?" he asked after a moment, his gaze shifting to Sarah. "Most mornings after my shift," Sarah replied. "It's the only time I really get to clear my head. I can see why. It's peaceful here, a world away from everything else." He paused, looking at her again with that same sharp gaze, as if sizing her up. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he added softly, almost as if he didn't mean for her to hear it. Curiosity gnawed at Sarah, but she didn't pry. Instead, she smiled and nodded, watching as Charles seemed to sink deeper into his own thoughts. After a few moments of silence, she decided it was time to go. "Take care of yourself, Charles," she said, giving him a warm smile. If you ever need help again, I'm usually around." Charles nodded, his eyes twinkling with something she couldn't quite place. "Thank you, Sarah. You're very kind." As Sarah walked away, she felt a strange tug in her chest, like something significant had just happened. She couldn't explain it, but her encounter with Charles left her with a sense of unease mixed with curiosity. Who was he really? And why did he seem so relieved to be treated like an ordinary person? Little did Sarah know, this brief encounter would soon lead her into a world of wealth, power, and danger that she couldn't have imagined. Charles Bennett, the elderly man she had helped in the park, was no ordinary retiree. He was a billionaire with a past full of secrets and enemies. And soon, Sarah's life would be turned upside down by her growing friendship with the mysterious Charles. The next morning, Sarah returned to the park, her mind still lingering on the mysterious Charles. She wondered if she'd see him again. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a pull to learn more about him, who he really was and why he had seemed so guarded. As she made her way down the path, she spotted him sitting on the same bench where they had parted ways the previous day. Charles's posture was more relaxed this time, and he waved her over with a warm smile. "Good morning, Sarah," he greeted, his voice light and friendly. "I wasn't sure I'd see you here again." "I like to keep a routine," she said, taking a seat beside him. "And it looks like you're becoming a regular here, too." Charles chuckled. "Perhaps I am. There's a certain peace here that I've come to appreciate." As they talked, Sarah learned more about Charles, but only in fragments. He spoke fondly of books, art, and history, but every time the conversation steered toward personal topics, Charles skillfully redirected it. Sarah could sense that he was hiding something, perhaps many things, but she didn't push. Instead, she enjoyed their conversations, finding them a welcome distraction from the pressures of her job. Over the next few weeks, their meetings in the park became a regular occurrence. Sarah found herself looking forward to their talks, intrigued by Charles's wisdom and the mystery surrounding him. But with each passing day, her curiosity grew stronger. Who was this man who seemed to know so much about the world but said so little about himself? One morning, as they sat together on the bench, Sarah decided to ask a more direct question. "Charles, you've lived an interesting life, haven't you?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose you could say that." "Why do I get the feeling there's more to you than meets the eye?" Sarah asked playfully, though there was a hint of seriousness in her tone. Charles looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment she thought he might open up, but then he shook his head with a soft chuckle. "Perhaps one day you'll find out," he said cryptically. Sarah laughed, but the curiosity gnawed at her even more. What was Charles hiding, and why was he so reluctant to share? As they parted ways that day, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her friendship with Charles was about to lead her down a path she hadn't expected. She just didn't know how deep that rabbit hole went. It was an ordinary evening, and Sarah had just finished another long shift at the hospital. As she walked through her front door, she absent-mindedly flipped on the television, hoping for some mindless entertainment to wind down. But as she flicked through the channels, something on the screen made her pause. There, on the evening news, was a live broadcast from a glamorous event, the kind attended by the city's wealthiest elites. And in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by cameras and reporters, stood Charles. Except this wasn't the Charles she knew. The man on the screen looked every bit the billionaire mogul, confident, commanding, and clearly accustomed to the spotlight. The reporter mentioned his name. Charles Bennett. The billionaire entrepreneur who owned multiple multinational corporations. Sarah froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. Charles Bennett? A billionaire? She had known there was more to Charles than he let on. But this? She couldn't wrap her head around it. The friendly, humble man she met in the park, the one who laughed at simple jokes and enjoyed their quiet conversations, was one of the wealthiest men in the world? As the shock wore off, Sarah felt a wave of confusion and betrayal. Why hadn't he told her? Had their entire friendship been built on a lie? What was his real motive in hiding his identity? Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Charles. "Can we talk tomorrow? I'll explain everything." Sarah's heart raced. What did he mean by everything? And how much was he hiding? The next morning, as Sarah walked to the park, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She needed answers, and she wasn't leaving the park without them. The air felt different as Sarah entered the park the next morning. The golden light of sunrise filtered through the trees, but the usual sense of calm that she associated with this place was nowhere to be found. Her mind raced with questions. She spotted Charles sitting on their usual bench, his face serious, as though he had been waiting for her for a long time. Sarah took a deep breath and approached him. "Charles," she greeted, her voice tighter than she intended. She sat down beside him, her hands folded in her lap, trying to steady herself for the conversation that was about to happen. "Sarah, I owe you an explanation," Charles began, his tone unusually somber. He glanced at her before turning his eyes toward the park, avoiding her gaze. "I know that what you saw on the news must have come as a shock." "That's one way to put it," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level. "You're a billionaire, Charles. How could you hide something like that?" Charles sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly as though he had been carrying a heavy weight for far too long. "It wasn't that I wanted to deceive you," he said slowly. "I just wanted to be seen for who I am, not what I am." Sarah frowned. "But why? What are you afraid of?" He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a sadness she hadn't seen before. "When people know about my wealth, it changes everything. I've spent decades building a life where no one sees me for the man I truly am. I'm always seen as a billionaire first, a commodity, someone people use to get what they want. I didn't want that with you." Sarah was silent for a moment, processing his words. It made sense in a way, but it didn't erase the feeling of betrayal she still harbored. "So, all those mornings we spent talking, all the times I confided in you, were you ever going to tell me the truth?" Charles's gaze softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw the vulnerability behind the carefully crafted exterior. "I wasn't planning to hide it forever. I wanted to tell you when the time was right, but then the media got involved, and it happened sooner than I expected." Sarah bit her lip, feeling a mixture of frustration and understanding. "I get it," she said after a long pause, "but this changes things, Charles. I don't know if I can just pretend like everything is the same." Charles nodded, his expression grave. "I know it's a lot to take in, but I want you to know that everything I've told you, every conversation we've had, was genuine. I value our friendship more than you realize." Sarah looked away, her heart conflicted. Part of her wanted to walk away from this confusing situation, but the other part of her, the part that had grown to care for Charles as a friend, held her back. "I don't know, Charles," she murmured. "I just don't know." Charles leaned closer, his voice gentle. "I understand, but I hope you'll give me a chance to explain more. I don't want to lose your friendship over this." Sarah sat in silence for a while, the wind rustling the leaves around them. She knew she needed time to process everything. She needed to figure out how she felt about the man sitting beside her, the man she thought she knew but now realized she had only scratched the surface of. "I need some time to think," she said finally, standing up. "I'll see you later, Charles." Charles nodded, not pressing her further. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." As Sarah walked away, she felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The Charles she had come to know was still there, but now she saw him in a new light, a light that revealed both the man and the billionaire, and it scared her. Days passed, and Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Charles. She replayed their conversations over and over in her head, dissecting every word, every glance, every hesitation. She had built a friendship with him based on trust, and now that trust had been shaken. She confided in her best friend Rachel during one of their coffee meetups. "He's a billionaire," Sarah explained, barely able to believe the words coming out of her mouth. "And he never told me. I mean, how would you feel if someone you trusted dropped that bomb on you?" Rachel nearly choked on her coffee. "A billionaire? Are you serious?" she asked, eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah nodded, fidgeting with the handle of her cup. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I don't even know him." Rachel placed a comforting hand on Sarah's. "Look, I get why you're upset. But maybe he was afraid. I mean, people probably use him all the time because of his money. You've told me how kind he's been to you, and that doesn't sound like a bad guy. Maybe give him a chance to explain more." Sarah sighed, knowing Rachel had a point. "I just don't know if I can be a part of that world," she admitted. "The media, the attention, the secrets, it's all too much." "You don't have to make any decisions right now," Rachel said. "Take your time, but don't shut him out without hearing him out." Sarah mulled over Rachel's advice for the next few days. Eventually, she made up her mind. She would meet Charles again, but on her terms. If she was going to move forward, she needed full transparency. No more half-truths or secrets. Sarah arrived at the park the next morning, her resolve stronger. Charles was already waiting, sitting on their usual bench, his expression hopeful yet cautious. She sat down beside him, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady. "I want to move forward, but if we're going to stay friends, I need honesty from you. No more secrets." Charles nodded, relief flooding his face. "I understand, and I promise, no more secrets." There was a pause before he spoke again, this time with more hesitation. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you. I've been invited to a charity gala next weekend. It's a significant event in the city, and I was hoping you'd accompany me." Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "A charity gala? As in, with celebrities and people who know you're a billionaire?" Charles smiled gently. "Yes. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think it would give you a glimpse of my world, the one I've kept hidden from you. I'd like you to see that side of my life if you're willing." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. The thought of entering that kind of world, the wealth, the attention, the expectations, was intimidating. But at the same time, she was curious. This could be her chance to understand the man behind the wealth, to see how he operated in the world that had shaped him. "Okay," she said slowly, surprising even herself. "I'll go." Charles's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. I promise I'll be there with you every step of the way." As they sat together in the park, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were stepping into uncharted territory, both aware that the path ahead would be filled with challenges. But for now, they had each other. The night of the gala arrived, and Sarah found herself standing in front of her mirror, staring at the elegant dress Charles had arranged for her. It was a deep emerald green, perfectly tailored to her figure, but still, she felt out of place. The gown belonged to a world she had never imagined entering, a world of billionaires, power, and influence. Her nerves were on edge, and she couldn't help but second-guess her decision to attend. What if she embarrassed herself? What if she didn't fit in? Before her anxiety could overwhelm her, the doorbell rang. Charles's driver had arrived. As Sarah climbed into the sleek black car, she felt her heart race. This was it. She was about to step into Charles's world, one filled with dazzling lights, wealth, and high society. When they arrived at the venue, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The grand ballroom was adorned with sparkling chandeliers, marble floors, and walls lined with priceless works of art. The attendees were dressed in luxurious gowns and tailored suits, their laughter echoing through the room as waiters passed by with trays of champagne. Charles, ever the gentleman, escorted Sarah inside, keeping a protective hand on her arm. He seemed at ease, accustomed to the attention and whispers that followed him wherever he went. But for Sarah, the night felt surreal. She saw faces she recognized from magazines and TV, business tycoons, celebrities, politicians, and all of them seemed to know Charles. As they made their way through the crowd, Sarah felt a growing unease. This world was glamorous, yes, but also isolating. She caught glimpses of the fake smiles, the whispered gossip, the superficial conversations. It was clear that in this world, people rarely showed their true selves. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted when a woman approached them. She was stunning, with long dark hair and a sharp smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Charles," she greeted, her voice smooth as silk. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight. And who is this?" "This is Sarah," Charles introduced. "A friend." The woman's eyes flicked over Sarah, assessing her. "A friend?" she repeated, her tone laced with curiosity. "How lovely." The conversation that followed was strained, and Sarah felt like an outsider in every sense of the word. But Charles remained close by her side, guiding her through the event with quiet reassurance. As the night wore on, Sarah realized that this was Charles's life, one filled with glamour but also with the constant pressure to maintain appearances. And for the first time, she began to understand why he had kept his true identity a secret. The gala continued, but for Sarah, the room felt increasingly stifling. As she navigated the opulent crowd, she found herself overhearing conversations that further cemented her feeling of unease. These people, while smiling and laughing, spoke in hushed tones about business deals worth billions, leveraging power in ways Sarah couldn't even begin to understand. And, despite their polished appearances, there was a predatory air to many of them. Charles, ever the gracious host, remained by Sarah's side. He introduced her to a few key figures, some of whom gave her fleeting looks of judgment, while others seemed genuinely curious about her. It was a delicate dance, this world of wealth and power. She could feel the undercurrent of competition and manipulation beneath the surface. As they moved toward a quieter section of the ballroom, Sarah spotted a familiar face from the media. Victor Hale. The very name sent a chill down her spine. Victor was known not only as one of Charles's fiercest business rivals, but also for his ruthless reputation. He was the kind of man who didn't play by the rules, who saw people as pawns in a much larger game. She had read about him in the tabloids, seen his name linked to scandals, and now here he was, laughing with a group of elites like he owned the room. "Victor Hale," Sarah whispered, turning to Charles. Charles's expression tightened briefly, but he composed himself quickly. "Yes, I knew he'd be here." "Does he know about us? About you and me?" Sarah asked nervously, her eyes flicking back toward the man who seemed larger than life. Charles looked at her, his eyes serious. "He knows everything, Sarah. In this world, nothing stays hidden for long." Victor must have sensed them staring because his eyes suddenly locked onto theirs. His smile widened as he excused himself from his group and began walking toward them. There was a glint in his eyes that sent Sarah's heart racing. She could sense danger in his every step, a predatory air that filled the space between them as he approached. "Charles," Victor greeted, his voice smooth and dripping with condescension. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight. And who is this lovely lady by your side?" Charles's hand rested protectively on Sarah's back. "This is Sarah, a friend." "A friend?" Victor's gaze lingered on her, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Ah, a friend. How nice." Sarah felt as though she were being studied. Assessed as though she were some new piece on a chessboard, Victor was eager to move. She kept her expression neutral, but her pulse quickened. "I've heard interesting things about you recently," Victor continued, his eyes still fixed on Sarah. "Quite the story in the papers, but I imagine you've grown used to such attention." "She's not interested in your games, Victor," Charles interjected, his voice calm but firm. Victor raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile still playing on his lips. Games? Oh, Charles, I don't play games. Not anymore. The tension between the two men was palpable, and Sarah could feel it like a physical force. Victor turned his gaze back to her, his smile growing darker. You should be careful, Miss Sarah. Being in Charles's orbit comes with certain risks. She's fine, Charles cut in, his voice steely. I'll make sure of that. Victor chuckled softly, a sound that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Well then, he said, turning back to Charles, I look forward to seeing how this plays out. With that, Victor turned and walked away, leaving Sarah and Charles standing in his wake, the air thick with tension. Who is he really? Sarah whispered, still shaken by the encounter. Someone you don't want to cross, Charles replied, his voice low, but he's already taken an interest in you because of me. Sarah felt her stomach churn. She knew that Victor Hale was dangerous, but now she was starting to see the full scope of what being associated with Charles meant. This wasn't just about wealth, it was about power, influence, and the enemies that came with it. And now she was in the crosshairs. The days following the gala were filled with an eerie calm, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. Her encounters with Victor had rattled her more than she cared to admit, and the coldness in his eyes haunted her even when she tried to push it from her mind. Charles remained protective, but Sarah could sense the tension in him too. He had always been poised, calm in the face of whatever the world threw at him, but since the gala, he had grown more watchful, more cautious. It was as though Victor's presence had awakened a danger they both knew existed, but hadn't spoken about. One evening, as Sarah was leaving her hospital shift, she noticed something unsettling. A car she had seen earlier in the day was parked across the street, and though it didn't seem suspicious at first, her instincts told her otherwise. The headlights were off, but she could feel eyes on her. Trying to remain calm, she quickened her pace and turned down a quieter street, taking a longer route home. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she glanced back to see if the car had moved. But it hadn't. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. She couldn't shake the thought that someone, perhaps Victor's people, were keeping tabs on her. By the time she reached her apartment, she was breathing hard. She locked the door behind her, leaning against it as if that would keep the rising fear at bay. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and when she pulled it out, her heart sank. An unknown number had sent her a message. Be careful who you trust. Her hands trembled as she stared at the words. There was no doubt in her mind now. Victor wasn't just playing games. He was watching her, waiting for her to slip up, and the message was a clear warning. She immediately called Charles, her voice shaking. Charles, something's happening. I think I'm being followed. There was a pause on the other end, and then Charles's voice came through, calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. Lock your doors and don't leave your apartment. I'm sending someone over right now. Who's doing this? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, though she already knew the answer. Victor, Charles said flatly. He's trying to scare you. Why? I haven't done anything to him, she said, pacing her living room, her mind racing. Because you're close to me, Charles replied, and that makes you a target. Within 30 minutes, Charles's private security had arrived at Sarah's apartment, along with Charles himself. His presence, though reassuring, only reminded her of how dangerous this situation had become. As the guards secured her apartment, Charles turned to Sarah, his face grim. Victor wants to intimidate you, to make you afraid enough to pull away from me. He's done this before to other people in my life. How far will he go? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Charles hesitated, and that hesitation was all the answer she needed. As far as he needs to, he admitted, his voice low, but we won't let it come to that. Sarah sat down, her mind reeling. She had known that being friends with a billionaire like Charles would come with complications, but she hadn't expected it to involve being hunted by one of the most dangerous men in the world. Sarah, listen to me, Charles said, sitting beside her. You're not alone in this. I've dealt with people like Victor for a long time. He plays mind games. He wants to push you to your breaking point. But I won't let him win." Sarah nodded, but the fear gnawed at her. She didn't want to live her life constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if Victor or his people were watching her. And more than that, she didn't want to be a liability to Charles. She could see how much this was weighing on him, how much he was carrying because of his world and the enemies that came with it. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't sign up for this kind of danger." Charles's eyes softened and he reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "You don't have to be a part of this if you don't want to be, Sarah. I'll understand if you want to step away. But I need you to know, this won't last forever. Victor's playing a dangerous game, but he's not invincible." Sarah looked into Charles's eyes and saw the determination there, the quiet strength he always carried with him. He wasn't asking her to stay, but he wasn't pushing her away either. She knew that if she walked away, Charles would protect her from afar, but something inside her told her she couldn't just leave him to face this alone. "I'll stay," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm not running." Charles squeezed her hand, a flicker of relief passing through his eyes. "We'll get through this. Together." With the decision made to stand by Charles, Sarah knew that her life was about to change even more dramatically. There was no more room for hesitation. Victor Hale was not going to back down, and she would need to be ready for whatever came next. Charles, ever the strategist, had his security team bolster the measures around Sarah's apartment and her workplace. He also began preparing a plan to confront Victor directly. "We can't let him keep playing these games," Charles explained one evening. "If we don't stop him now, he'll keep coming for us." "But how do you stop someone like him?" Sarah asked, her mind swirling with the possibilities. "By hitting him where it hurts the most. His empire," Charles replied, his expression grim. "I have enough information on Victor to expose some of his more unsavory business practices. It won't be easy, but if we can make enough noise, we can take him down." As the plan began to unfold, Sarah realized just how far Charles was willing to go to protect her and dismantle Victor's power. They were entering dangerous territory, but there was no turning back now. The tension between Charles, Sarah, and Victor Hale reached a boiling point as Charles executed his plan. He had gathered enough evidence to expose Victor's corrupt dealings to the public, but he knew it wouldn't be without consequences. The night of their final confrontation felt like the calm before a storm. Charles's network of investigators had unearthed documents that revealed Victor's ties to illegal activities, money laundering, and the exploitation of vulnerable industries. With these in hand, Charles was ready to strike. Victor, aware of the impending move, retaliated by tightening his grip on those around Charles, including Sarah. One evening, while Sarah was under heightened security, Victor made a final desperate attempt to intimidate Charles by threatening Sarah's life directly. His men approached her, sending a message that they could get to her no matter where she was. But Charles had anticipated this and set a trap of his own. Using the evidence he had gathered, he called in favors from law enforcement and exposed Victor's entire operation. In a dramatic sting operation, Victor was arrested in front of the world. His empire collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, leaving him powerless and facing a lifetime in prison. With Victor finally behind bars, the weight of fear and intimidation lifted from Sarah and Charles's lives. Sarah was no longer just a nurse entangled in the dangerous world of billionaires. She had become someone stronger, someone who had faced down threats and emerged victorious. Charles, relieved to have eliminated his greatest rival, turned his focus back to what mattered most: building something meaningful. He had spent years living under the shadow of enemies and now had the opportunity to dedicate his wealth to something good. Together, he and Sarah worked to establish charitable ventures, including the foundation for Sarah's dream clinic, which would provide care to those in need. The clinic became a symbol of hope, and as they stood at its opening ceremony, the nightmare that had followed them seemed like a distant memory. Sarah's world, once small and simple, had expanded into something she had never imagined. And Charles, no longer bound by the dangers of his past, was finally free to live the life he wanted, alongside someone who saw him for who he really was. Sarah and Charles's journey together had been fraught with danger, manipulation, and power plays, but through it all, they found strength in each other. What began as a chance encounter in the park had blossomed into a partnership that stood the test of time and threats from powerful enemies. Together, they built not just a friendship, but a legacy, one that would continue to help others long after Victor Hale's name was forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this journey. This story of facing challenges, standing up to powerful forces, and building a lasting legacy is one we hope will inspire you to stand up for what you believe in. If you've been moved by what you've seen, please hit that subscribe loud button and ring the bell icon so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this. Leave us a comment below about what resonated with you most. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And remember, no matter how powerful the forces against you may seem, when you stand by your values, you can make a difference. Share this video to spread the message of integrity and perseverance.